hello, everyone, and welcome back to All the Things with Lane and Laney. We're doing our best to get you some fantastic guests, and I think this guy is going to be a phenomenal one for you to listen to and enjoy. He has been dubbed the motivational Jim Carrey. So if that doesn't put a smile on your face and pique your interest, well, then I think you're dead inside. Being a tenured professor with a PhD, he is known as being authority in the leadership development, motivation, and communication skills for over 20 years. With that said, we were intrigued to speak with him on his passion for literacy. As an author, he has been represented in over 50 news articles, journals, and magazines. His work has been featured in the Los Angeles Times as well as USA Today, and he has written 14 books.
Oh.
Has he got your attention yet? But wait, he's also a speaker. His value has been delivered to people in the US and Canada, having traveled over 100 days last year to deliver his messages. He's also a television presence. Yeah, I know, he's making me feel lazy too. Without further delay, let's get to him. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Danny Brassell.
And thanks for all you do. We need more inspiring podcasts for people to listen. We have too much negativity in the world.
Exactly.
Yes, we do.
That's our goal here.
So you have some awesome credentials. Can you give everybody your backstory and how you got into this line of work?
Well, that's a great question, Lane. Thanks for that. It's ironic people consider me America's leading reading ambassador because I grew up hating reading. My father was a public librarian, and I always hated the public library growing up. They always smelled funny to me. There was uncomfortable furniture. There was always an elderly woman telling me to be quiet. And there's always some freaky homeless guy who thinks he's a vampire hanging out by the shelves. And it wasn't until I started teaching in the inner city in South Central Los Angeles where I observed that a lot of the students I taught didn't have the advantages I had growing up. I mean, I grew up with both parents in my home. We were lower middle class, but we always had food on the table.
Right.
My parents always made sure there was all kinds of things to read around us. They read to my brother, sister, and me. They read in front of us. And I realized shame on me. I was given a lot, and I always took it for granted. And so I became very passionate about getting kids excited about reading. I mean, I think schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching people how to read if they never want to read? I teach people why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go watch TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read a book. I want them to choose to do it on their own because they like it. The trick is the more exciting we can get people to read, the more likely they are to read. And the more they read, the better they get. So I'm very passionate about this and spreading the joy of reading all around the world.
Okay. So where did you grow up? Where's home?
I grew up everywhere. It's like witness protection program. I was born in upstate New York. Then we moved to San Diego, California. Then we moved to Iowa. Then we moved to Durango, Colorado.
Wow.
And then my parents decided they didn't want my brother and sister to turn out like me. So they stayed in Durango. And then I went to my undergrad in Washington, D.C., and then I lived in Spain, and I taught in Houston, and then the majority of my career has been in South Central Los Angeles, so everywhere. And now, you know, I get to go all over the world. I'm now a visiting distinguished professor at the American University in Cairo, and so I get to do lots of work in Egypt, the UAE, India, and Pakistan are where my hot points are right now.
Wow.
Holy smokes. Is that all remotely, or is that you traveling over there and doing your thing?
Well, it was remotely for a while. It's so much more fun when I get to be. This is actually kind of a cool anecdote, Lane and Laney, was when I was in Egypt right before the pandemic hit. I spoke to a couple of Muslim schools, and I didn't know what to expect. And at 2:00 in the afternoon, 400 parents showed up to one of my trainings. And it was like the Muslim Brotherhood. All the guys had long beards and all the women were wearing burqas. And we were talking like we're all talking right now. And I thought to myself, shame on me. I had all these preconceptions and it turned out to be my best audience ever. I started off the presentation like, I was reading this book. Have any of you ever read the Quran? And they all laughed. I'm like, no. Well, if you've read the Quran, you know the story when the archangel Gabriel appears in the cave to Muhammad. What's his first instruction to Muhammad? Because the first pillar of Islam is to read. And so I told the parents, so not only should we get your kids reading, it's actually written in your most sacred text that it's your duty to get your kids reading. And the entire audience starts nodding. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my dream audience. And I got along and it's so great. I mean, this is what, if I was ever president, I'd give people 10 grand to go travel abroad, because there's two things you learn when you travel abroad. First of all, you get to really have a better perspective of the rest of the world, and you start to realize, oh, we're not all that different from one another. And then second of all, you start to realize a lot of the stuff we totally take for granted in America and gripe about every day. And I'm like, people don't even know. And so I've been blessed, and now I'm starting to get on the road again now. Hopefully, I always tell this to people, this doesn't have to be political. Either get a vaccine or wear your mask. That's what we do, because we're all part of a community. I mean, being an American doesn't mean just freedom without any kind of obligation. We have to help one another. I mean, that's the reason we all drive on the right-hand side of the road. There has to be some civility in society. And so that's one of the things I'm really starting to preach a lot more to people is that, hey, folks, we don't have to agree with one another, but we also don't have to be disagreeable with one another. And kids are my passion is with kids. I'm like, kids are watching us every day. And if they're going to see us being rude to one another, they're going to grow up to be those same types of people. So we need to set a better example. And so that's pretty much why I eliminate negative people out of my life. I don't watch TV anymore. I do podcasts like this. I listen to podcasts that are positive as opposed to people griping about something. And I think that one of my mentors, Charlie Tremendous Jones, said, you're the same today as you will be in 5 years, except for two things: the people you meet and the books you read. So I always tell my students, be wise, surround yourself with really positive people, and make sure you fill your mind with really positive books.
That's a great motto.
Great motto. I can understand the reasoning why you thought it'd be a terrible place over there in the Muslim world.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why we're presented all those images of negativity on the news and things like that. So you're entrenched in all this positivity. Do you have people come up to you that just are clawing at you and saying, how do I get out of my own head, and how do I get out of my negativity and things like that?
All the time. I mean, and again, I didn't grow up a reader, and I resent myself for that, because I'm like, oh, all those years I wasted that I could have been filling my mind with incredible stories. Now I read everything. I'm an eclectic reader. I probably fit the profile of a serial killer at this point, all the different one of my book clubs online is one of the top book clubs in the world. It's called lazyreaders.com. If any of your listeners want to go there, it's a free subscription. Once a month for the rest of your life, I'm going to update it with 10 book recommendations, 3 or 4 adult level, 3 or 4 young adult level, and 3 or 4 children's level books, all under 250 pages. So you have something you can read while you're stuck in a boring meeting or whatever. People often tell me, oh, Danny, I have no time to read. I'm like, yeah, who has time to read after you watch the game on TV, have a couple of beers, go out shopping? It's fascinating. I was doing research on this recently. I found out that 100 years ago, they only had 24 hours in their day as well. And I have a friend that teaches time management seminars, and I always give him a hard time. I'm like, there's no such thing as time management. There's only priority management. What do you prioritize in your life? If you want to prioritize yourself, I'm going to watch the news every day and gripe about my government for 12 hours a day. Well, that's power to you. That's the world you're going to live in. And if you're going to say, no, I refuse to allow people to be rude to one another around me, we're going to set some ground rules. It's amazing. I find that, and I set ground rules, and people are reflective of whatever you will allow them. You train people how to treat you. I won't allow people to give me, and politics, I'm over politics. This is how I know I'm old. I'm over that. I'm into solutions, not people griping about problems. Surround yourself with problem solvers, that people that, hey, we don't have to agree with one another, but hey, we're going to figure out a way to solve some issues. And so that's what I love about reading, is I get to Reading enlightens me. It's a relaxing activity, and it informs me all the time. The older I get, the more I realize how little I know. I thought it was only my wife who would point this out to me all the time. I actually learned something yesterday. I don't know if you guys know this. I always thought the book I'm writing right now, so the last book I wrote was called Leadership Begins with Motivation, and it's kind of like an updated homage to Paul Harvey. I grew up listening to Paul Harvey on the radio. He passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 325 years old. And I used to love listening to Paul Harvey. He'd come on the radio every day at 12:15. He'd say, "I'm Paul Harvey with the rest of the story." And he'd tell this story, and the entire story you're trying to figure out who is he talking about or what's the company. And I used to read those to my students, but I realized, wait a sec, a lot of his stories are about like Sears Roebuck. Nobody knows about Sears Roebuck anymore if they were born in the 21st century. And so the book I wrote was an homage to that, but the stories are much more contemporary. But after I wrote the book, I went through it and I'm like, oh my gosh, unintentionally, I'm like, most of my examples are white male Americans. Yeah. And so the book I'm writing right now is a book that's intentionally more minorities, female, and international. Mm-hmm. And so I was researching a story yesterday, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how did I not know this? I always thought that Sally Ride was the first woman in space. Sally Ride was an astronaut for America back in I think it was 1981. Okay. I find out yesterday in my research that the Russians sent a woman up to space in 1963, and the woman's still alive. The woman's still alive. She serves in their Congress. I'm like, how did I not know this? It's unbelievable. And that's what I love about reading. I mean, I used to teach history to kids, and the first thing I teach when I teach history is history books are usually written by the winners. Every event in history has multiple points of view. And my job as your teacher is not to teach you what to think, it's to teach you how to think. I think we'd all be much better off if people would stop letting other people tell them how to think and actually research things on their own and figure these things out. I'm sorry, you always ask short questions. This is my bad habit. I come
That's okay.
Short questions.
Oh no, chat away.
So I'm wondering, since you said as a child you weren't a big reader, when did that flip? When did you finally enjoy reading?
Yeah, it was really when I started noticing that my kids weren't reading, and I'm like, wow, kids aren't stupid. They don't see me reading. I'm never going to be reading. And so I decided to become a reader. And, I love biography. So I'd read a biography called The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. It's actually part of a trilogy. That book takes you to the moment Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. The second book is called Theodore Rex. It takes you through his presidency. And then the third book is called Colonel Roosevelt, takes you through what he did after his presidency. And I got to confess, before I read this book, I knew only two things about Teddy Roosevelt. I knew that teddy bears were named after him, and for some reason, his face is on Mount Rushmore. Oh my gosh. You talk about a 6-year period in a person's life. They don't make him like Teddy anymore. When he was 36 years old, he was police commissioner of New York City. When he was 37, he was assistant secretary of the United States Navy. When he was 38, he led the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. When he was 40, he was elected governor of New York, and I don't believe he even had an affair. When he was 42, he was elected vice president of the United States. Later that year, following the assassination of President McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt became then and to this day the youngest person ever to be president of the United States. I'm like, not a bad 6-year period. I've gone almost 3 months without a parking ticket. I feel pretty proud of myself. I set the bar pretty high. Yeah. But what fascinated me about this book, Lainey, was he was sick all the time as a kid. And so he spent all this time reading. He was a speed reader, he had a photographic memory, and he could read in 6 languages. They say you could give him an 800-page book in Latin at dinner, and he would quote pages to you at the breakfast table. They estimate by the time he was 30 years old, Teddy Roosevelt had read over 20,000 books. And so now you have to do what my little ones do when I say that. You have to say, wow. So you go, wow. Yeah. So I'm like, all right, kids, we got to read a lot of kid books. And so that's what I tell people now. I read 10 books a day now. Many of them are pop up and scratch and sniff, but I do read 10 books a day. It's actually a tip I give people too, just to look intelligent at parties. Before I go to a party, I'll go to like a bookstore, like a Barnes and Noble, to the children's section, and I'll read a bunch of picture biographies on famous people and just slip in facts during conversation. People think I'm really bright. And I'm like, no, I just read a picture book on Steve Jobs. And a lot of times it's those picture books that inspire me to read adult level books about the kids. But it's amazing. And I actually always say that to parents anyway. You should reread your favorite children's book as an adult. You'll get a different take on it. I mean, I always point out to people, Dr. Seuss wrote the Lorax 50 years before anybody was paying attention to the environment. I mean, I was just speaking in Boise, Idaho a couple of weeks ago. You couldn't see 3 feet in front of you because of all the smoke from all the forest fires. I'm like, man, people need to start. I mean, look at people on the Gulf Coast with these crazy hurricanes now. I'm like, I think we need to put the politics aside and figure out how can we make sure that our kids live in a safer world anyway, a cleaner world.
We are living in an environment. We could all start there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I'd always wanted to pitch a show. When I was living in Los Angeles, I pitched a show to a network called Common Grounds, and it would be me at a bar hosting a Republican and a Democrat, and we'd all share whatever beverage we wanted to share, and I'd give them an issue like healthcare or education, and they would both have their extreme positions, but they would have to figure out where's the common ground, where's something that we can all agree on and get something done. Because I don't see enough about that. I think I go all over the place, and I'm like, America's not Fox News or MSNBC. Most Americans are pretty sensible people. We need to stop thinking red and blue and think of red, white, and blue. All of us have responsibility. We should all be very proud of our country. And we should be excited that all of us are different. I mean, if we were all the same, the pandemic would have wiped us out, but it didn't because we're different. And we should be embracing those different. You don't have to agree with it. My wife and I disagree almost all the time and everything. It doesn't mean I don't love and respect her, and that's a lesson that I think kids would be much better served if they saw adults seeing the adults setting a positive example to the little ones.
Oh, absolutely.
I agree.
I was gonna say, you think that's due to literacy and laziness and lack of reading, that everyone nowadays is just so sensitive to just their issues, their beliefs, not to get political, but you get people that are just so self-centered and say, well, I saw this on a news channel and that's the only news channel I watch, and this is what I believe, and you're wrong if you think that I'm wrong, and therefore I'm going to yell and scream at you until my views are taken in by you, and the other person's thinking the exact same way. So that idea for a show is just fantastic. You don't get to leave the room until middle ground is met.
Yeah.
Really,
I love the word that you used, the expression you said, Lane, that I liked was self-centered, because I think too many of us are self-centered. That's how I know I'm getting older, because I realize I don't really know that much and I might be wrong on everything. And so it's really important for me to listen to other people. I was actually just with a class a couple of weeks ago. And so I said, well, let's look at things from different points of view. So we use the example of the war in Iraq. And I said, do you know we lost over 5,000 soldiers in Iraq? And the kids were like, oh my, and I'm like, this is something, and we talked about it for 10 minutes. I'm like, okay, now let's do a different point of view. Do you know that over 1 million Iraqi civilians were killed in that war? The kids are like, what? And I'm like, I'm not saying that you have to think that way. I'm saying you have to appreciate there's a point of view there.
Sure.
There's some pent up tension there. And again, you don't have to agree with it. I mean, right now, I would love to speak with students about Afghanistan. I'm like, okay, well, let's look at Afghanistan. We lost almost 3,000 troops in Afghanistan. We lost 13 troops just a couple of weeks ago. Let's look at this point of view. I'm like, okay, let's look at this point of view. We were spending $200 million a week on the war in Afghanistan. And again, I'm not here. I don't care. I don't want to influence you. I don't care about that. I want you to consider different things. This is where I like being around people that disagree with me, because it forces me to think. And this is why I love reading about that. The book I just read was called American Caesar by William Manchester. I read the book for two reasons. I had just read a trilogy on Winston Churchill by William Manchester. And after reading that trilogy, I'm like, I think Winston Churchill may have been the most important person to live on the planet in the 20th century. I used to think it was like Gandhi or Nelson Mandela or something. I think we're all Nazis if it's not Winston Churchill. I think the guy, I really do. I mean, the guy was that was his, and he had plenty of faults. And that's what I always tell people, read about historical figures, because there's good and bad to everybody. And you have to acknowledge these things. But I read the book for two reasons. First of all, William Manchester wrote the book, and the book was on General MacArthur. Now, I had read a biography called Truman by David McCullough, wonderful presidential biography. And one of the big things that Truman did was he fired General MacArthur when he was president for insubordination. And so I went into this book thinking Douglas MacArthur is just a jerk. And I came away reading the book and I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, he had an ego. All these guys have an ego. But gosh, he did some amazing things. I had no idea that General MacArthur, he really didn't believe in war. He had a major problem committing forces to anything where he would lose soldiers. And if you look at the statistics, he's the most successful general we've ever had in history. For every 10 Japanese that died, we only lost 1 American. Wow. And then to show, the other thing I didn't know was he became the first administrator of Japan after the war to rebuild Japan. And they love him in Japan. There's like monuments of this guy basically created them into a first world economy within 1 generation of them being devastated by the war. And it's just, that's what I love about reading. I'm like, wow, that's a totally different take I had on that person. Yeah. And I say that to my students. I'm like, if you haven't read a book that you like, it's your responsibility to write that book. You know, let's read about. I mean, when I was in New Orleans a couple of years ago, and I said, why haven't any of you written a book about Hurricane Katrina? I would love to read a book written from a 12-year-old's perspective on Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, that would be cool.
I mean, I like different perspectives. Again, you know, sometimes things aren't well written. Sometimes I disagree with everything a person said. I mean, it doesn't matter, and who cares? This is how I know I'm getting old, because I realize I'm not all that. And I actually made this point to my own 3 children who were on social media. I'm like, you know, there's this incredible feature and you can see that on next to a keyboard or next to your iPhone. It's the space there. You don't have to respond to every negative thing. No. You know, if people want to throw out negativity out there, let them. That's fine. You don't have to respond to it. You know, and I really emphasize this to kids, because I'm like, you know, there's a history of everything you've ever posted on these social media. And when you start looking for jobs, that some of the savvier employers are going to pay attention to what you posted. And you've seen it in society where a person posted something, 10 years ago, and they lose the job because of something they posted 10 years ago. But our counter argument to that is, maybe you shouldn't have posted that. You don't have to post that negativity.
Yeah, your negativity or every single thought.
Not the problem.
Yeah, every single thought that comes into your mind, you don't have to post it on social media site. We had a guest on, our last guest actually went to the Burning Man Festival, and he was going to recount some of his experiences there, and he didn't want his face or his name brought onto the podcast for that reason. He didn't want people to, judge him or look him up on Facebook or wherever he could be found if he was to ever leave his job and go to another job. So reading your book on Winston Churchill, did he wear women's clothes?
No, he did not. But I shouldn't say that. He did wear nightgowns from time to time. Did you know when Truman was president, Churchill hung out at the White House as an uninvited guest for like 4 months, and he required every morning he had to drink a bottle of scotch. Every lunch he drank a bottle of champagne. The guy was crazy. Wow. Yeah. He's an interesting guy. I mean, he was racist. If you look at like a lot of his writings and stuff. And again, I always point this out to people. I'm like, think about your own life. Would you like the worst things that you've ever done to be the central focus of people? I mean, and so that's why I always hope, hey, make sure your life is for a positive focus, because all of us have good and bad. None of us have been perfect. And Churchill's a fascinating, but you read this in a lot of these. I read a picture book on Elon Musk, and it inspired me to read his biography by Ashley Vance. And there was 2 stories in that book that were fascinating to me about Elon Musk. Was he's at a Mexican restaurant with his biographer eating chips and drinking a margarita. And he's like, so I'm dating this new woman. I'm contemplating allocating 8.5 hours a week for her. Do you think that's sufficient? I'm like, who talks like that? He's like timing his relationship. And then the thing that was actually really interesting, though, was at SpaceX, a lot of his engineers were getting annoyed because he was asking them questions all the time. And then the engineers were like, man, I already got this job. Why is he interviewing me again? But then they started comparing notes, like, wait a second. His questions are getting more sophisticated. He's listening to our answers. He's learning it. And I think he knows it better than we do now. And that was fascinating, because Elon Musk is a guy who even a CEO of 4 companies right now, he still reads at least a couple of books a day. I mean, he's an avid reader. He was bullied as a kid. And so he spent all of his time, the library was his refuge. So I love reading about people, and especially people that I might not agree with, because I want to figure out what's their fuel.
Yeah.
And it's tough with like a politician. My dad, he said that you can't really trust a presidential biography until they've been dead for 50 years because everybody has an agenda. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah. So I'm up to Eisenhower right now is who I'm reading about. After Eisenhower, I guess JFK I can do in a couple of years, but there's a lot of truth to, and I've read Edmund Morris, who wrote The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, which is one of the greatest presidential biographies I read. He won the Pulitzer Prize for that in 1979. He impressed President Reagan so much that President Reagan made him his official biographer. And he wrote a book on Reagan called Dutch, which is one of the worst presidential biographies I've ever read. I'm like, how do you take a guy? I mean, Reagan was such a fascinating guy, and it was such a boring book. I'm like, how do you do that? I mean, he only spent like 2 pages on the assassination. I'm like, how do you only spend 2 pages on it was crazy. But then I came across, I have a book right here, the Reagan Diaries, which President Reagan is the only president in history to keep a daily diary as president. And it's fascinating because you get into his mind. You're like, oh, wow. I mean, it cracks you up too, because it's like every Thursday, him and Vice President Bush had Mexican food together and talked. I'm like they're just hanging out and he was into patterns, and so he like had to watch movie screenings every night, and he had to ride his horse all the time. It was fascinating. I'm like, wow, it's just kind of interesting getting into the person's mind. I love that. I love biographies. I love learning about people, but I'll read anything.
Let's say, how do you digest a book so fast? I mean, are you up to the Elon Musk level as much as you've read? Or are you down to the Eisenhower, but the Roosevelt level, the Bill Clinton level? Those guys just amaze me that they can just zip through. I mean, you look at any type of politician like a Bill Clinton or a Roosevelt that can get these gigantic bills in front of them, and they just put their readers on and just and
they read them. You're like, wow, how'd you do that? No, I'm not that. It depends on what I'm reading, Lane. If it's something I'm interested in, I'm reading a book right now by Ronald Brownstein about Los Angeles in 1974, and it takes you through movies, TV, music, and politics. And the politics part isn't that interesting to me, but like it's fascinating to me because some people collect automobiles, some people collect shot glasses. I collect stories. I'm always reading, and I have this horrible habit. I'm always taking notes in books. After every book I read, I take pictures of it with my iPhone, and I store those stories into folders on my computer. Because I'm like, so if somebody asks me to speak on integrity, I have a file for integrity. I have like 30 different stories I can share from that, or responsibility or communication skills or something. I'm always looking for anecdotes. And yeah, it's fascinating. This book I'm reading, I had no idea All in the Family by Norman Lear started off. It was a British show. He bought the rights to the British show. It's a copy. I hadn't thought that was original. I'm like, how did I never know that? I didn't know Jack Nicholson, when he moved to LA, he moved to live with his big sister. And it turned out his big sister was actually his mother. You know, the woman he thought was his mother was actually his grandmother. The woman he thought was his sister was his aunt. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Anecdote. I'm always looking for the anecdote. Like I had read, have you guys read Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson?
No.
Haven't.
No.
Okay. So, all right, I'm going to tell you a story. This is a true story. I love that book because Steve Jobs was really good with Isaacson's he used to be the editor at Time. He's written all kinds of great books. And what I loved was he only agreed to do this book because Steve Jobs said, you can show the good and the bad, because he's like most of these guys. He's great in some things and he's a jerk in other things. Yeah. And one of the stories that I'm going to get goosebumps when I tell, this is a true story, is Steve Jobs was adopted. And I was making this point on a speech. We were talking about immigration. I'm like, oh, you don't want immigrants in America? Just so you know, Steve Jobs, his father was a Syrian refugee. If we didn't accept him, we wouldn't have Apple computers. As a matter of fact, almost all of Silicon Valley are immigrants. So let's have the actual discussion about immigration. You know, none of us on this podcast would be here if it wasn't for immigration, you know. But there's a great story. he was adopted. And when Apple went public, he made like $100 million overnight. And so he hired a private investigator to find his birth mother. And it only took about a week. And so he set up a meeting with his birth mother, who was living in Los Angeles. And there's a Star Wars moment where all of a sudden the mother, she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry I gave you away, Steve." And he's like, "Oh, no, my parents have been great." So one point in his defense was that he always called his adoptive parents his parents, which I love that. I thought that was classy. But then there's the Star Wars moment where she's like, "Steve, there's something you need to know. You have a sister." So it turns out his sister is Mona Simpson. Mona Simpson's a best-selling novelist. She wrote, one of the books she wrote was called Anywhere But Here, which was made into a movie back in the 90s with Susan Sarandon and Natalie Portman.
Yeah.
So they get together and they became best friends. They talked every day for the rest of his life. Well, Mona's talking to Steve one day and she's like, "Steve, you and I have the same father. I've never met our father. Do you think you can hire this private investigator to find our father?" He's like, "Oh, yeah, sure." So a week later, he's having lunch with Mona, slips her a 3x5 card. He's like, "He found him. There's all of his information. If you want to go meet him, you can, but you got to promise me one thing. I don't want him to even know that I exist." So she's like, "Okay." So she flies up to Sacramento. He's running a small restaurant in Sacramento. It's very tense for about 5 hours. And finally they warm up to one another. He's like, "Oh, Mona, I'm so sorry about giving you away. I'm so sorry you have to see me like this. I used to be really successful. I used to run much bigger restaurants. I used to run the biggest restaurant in Silicon Valley. Get this, Mona. One time, Steve Jobs came into my restaurant."
Oh,
She's staring right at him and she can't tell him, "That's your son."
yeah.
Wow.
That's a true story. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is like better than Dallas or Knots Landing." I'm like, "This is like the greatest story ever." So, I mean, if I can read a whole book and get a story like that, that's gasoline for me.
Let's say the way you present material and the way that I'm sure that you act the same way on stage, who inspired you to be the presenter that you are? Not just giving the message, but
Nobody's ever
such
asked
a
me
way
that
that
question.
people remember it.
Yeah, so I mean, I've never met a microphone I never liked. I've performed since I was a little kid. My mom was an actress, so I guess she's probably the one that I have to give all the credit to. But I watch everybody, and I train speakers among other things. And I always tell people, if you want to become a good speaker, first of all, you got to watch lots of speakers. And so I watch probably 10 speakers a day. I mean, I watch politicians, I'll watch televangelists, I'll watch stand-up comedians, I'll watch them give TED Talks, I'll watch them give keynote speeches. I always tell people I like to watch award shows because I'm like, can this person give a coherent thought in 45 seconds? And when I was watching the Academy Awards a couple of years ago, I thought, maybe I should train Hollywood actors, because I guarantee you Brad Pitt, somebody wrote his speech for him because his speech was really good. I'm like, that wasn't just off the cuff. It was written.
Yeah.
I'll watch people in front of large groups, people in front of small groups. International is a different, working with women versus men. I love it. And so I'm constantly, Picasso said, good artist copy and great artist steal. So I can't say that anything is unique to me. I've probably stolen from everybody. I mean, probably my two favorite speakers of all time are Jim Rohn is one of my favorites. He inspired, he was basically the coach for Tony Robbins and Les Brown and, some of the greatest speakers, Connie Podesta, all these great, Darren Hardy, some of the best speakers out there, learn from Jim Rohn. Jim Rohn, he has a drawl or whatever. He's like, if you want to change. You're not a tree. I mean, I love little things like that.
That's the guy. We've talked about him before. He
just cracks me up.
He's got a great message, but that voice and that draw he does just annoys the hell out of me. I don't know why.
Yeah, and you know what? It's funny because when you said that, because his doesn't annoy me. My other favorite speaker was Zig Ziglar, and Zig Ziglar from Mississippi, and he sounds like a televangelist, and it drove me nuts listening to him. But gosh, the guy cracks me up. He says so many lines. He has so many lines. He's like, a lot of my Christian friends get on their high horses and they say, Zig, you're only interested in cold, hard cash. I'm here to tell you the cash is neither cold nor hard. It's warm. Soft, feels good. I mean, his delivery is just incredible. I mean, I love Les Brown. Les Brown's great. I mean, but I like I definitely like speakers. I gravitate towards people that can make me laugh. But I once had an editor, and he told me something really valuable. He said, Danny, if you want to be a great writer, he's like, you're really good at making people laugh. He's like, but if you want to be a great writer, you got to make him laugh, you got to make him cry, and you got to make him think. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with a good speech, a proper speech. If you can get people to do all of those different emotions in one speech, you've done a great thing. So I'm always looking for great people. But Jim Rohn and Zig Ziglar would probably be, those are the two I listen to more than anybody. And you're right, Lane. I mean, it can annoy you, the sound of the voice, but it's also a tool. I guarantee you he doesn't speak like that. He's using it as a tool. It's the same thing if you ever watch old routines with George Burns. George Burns, his cigar was his tool. So he would say the punchline, and as people are laughing, that's when he's smoking.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just a little theater trick he learned.
Yeah. Not to mention, I think that was actually a man in a monkey suit with a pair of glasses. He looked exactly like a chimp.
Yeah.
Totally unrelated, but he's great.
Yeah, he was fantastic.
So on a personal level, I want to know how to read more. I want to know, and maybe you can help me with this. Maybe it's just a busy time in my life. Maybe it's just not setting the priorities right in the foundation. We've got 2 children, 8 and 5. She runs her own job. I do my own job. We get done at the end of the day, and all we want to do is just mind melt. We feel like the full day has been taken up. But I've always got this itching to read more. It just feels like there's no time in our day to do so. Mm-hmm. And that's just one aspect. And I'll go on to a couple other ones with you, but if you could.
Yeah, that's why it's a perfect question, Lane. I mean, that's why I created my online reading engagement program. So the 2 numbers I always point to for people are 20 and 67. So researchers were interested in what makes people successful. So they studied students around the world and looked for common characteristics. They discovered one which floored them, and it was the number of minutes spent reading outside of school. They looked at low students, average students, and high students. They found that the students in the 20th percentile, towards the bottom of the class, averaged less than a minute a day of reading outside of school. That didn't surprise anybody. That's why they're probably at the bottom of the class. This did surprise them. The kids in the 70th percentile, the C students in the middle, the average students, they average 9.6 minutes a day reading outside of school. So when I'm doing a live training with parents, this is usually when the first parent raises a hand and says, wait a sec, are you saying if I can get my kid to read 10 minutes a day, I can get them from an F to a C? That's exactly what I'm telling you. The research is pretty conclusive on this, but this floors people even more. The kids at the top, near the top of the class, the 90th percentile, do they spend 3 hours a day reading outside of school? No. Do they spend 1 hour a day reading outside of school? No. The average was just over 20 minutes a day. 20 minutes a day. This is my goal for everybody, whether you're a kindergartner or a rocket scientist. We're going to get you reading 20 minutes a day. And here's the 2 little tricks there. First of all, they don't have to be consecutive. So if you have to do 1 minute 20 times a day, do that. If you, and then the second thing that's really important is it doesn't have to be you reading. Listening to an audiobook is just as good as you reading it. And so one of the tricks I'll train parents to do is if it takes you 10 minutes each way to drive your kids to school, put in an audiobook, you just covered your 20 minutes on the commute. Yeah. It's a great one. When I'm working out in the gym, I'm always listening to audiobooks when I'm working out. And so then the other number I gave is 67. So you'll hear a lot of people say it takes 21 days to change a habit. And to those people, I say, show me the research. It's a completely fabricated number. I know exactly where the number comes from. It's from a wonderful book written in 1960 by Dr. Maxwell Maltz called Cybernetics. Now, Dr. Maltz was a plastic surgeon, and in the preface of the book, he said he noticed it takes most of his patients about 21 days to get used to their new faces. Well, a lot of people took that number, a lot of self-help gurus, personal development people, a lot of people that I respect and admire took that number and started saying it takes 21 days to change a habit. It's a completely fabricated number. So researchers at the University of London in 2009 did a habit formation study, and they discovered it took anywhere from 18 to 254 days to change a habit. And the average was 66 days. Now, I don't like the number 66, so I threw in a bonus day, 67 days. And I'll tell you why this is critical. Lainey, let's say you decide you're going to go on a diet. You follow it religiously for 21 days. But then on day 22, you fall off the wagon. You fail. You blame yourself. Well, that's wrong, because research shows on average, it takes at least 3 times longer than that. I mean, it depends on the habit you're trying to change as well. So for example, they found if you want to drink a glass of water before breakfast, that might take 18 days to form that habit. But if you want to quit smoking, that's going to take 254 days to change that habit. And so what I'm always trying to do, my entire program is in just over 2 months, we're going to figure out how to get you to do those 20 minutes a day. And so here's a quick tip. One of the best tips I give parents, I have a feeling television is here to stay. And so President Bush Sr. 30 years ago signed a very important law in this country that said every television set sold in America has to have closed captioning. Turn on the closed captioning on the TV. And people say, well, wait a sec, Danny, if the show's in English and the subtitles are in English, what good does that do? That's a fair point, but let me make this point. Have you ever watched a show with subtitles and not looked at the subtitles? It's very difficult to do. Your brain is directed towards that text, and there's research to support this. So if you look at reading scores around the world, the more kids watch TV, the lower their reading scores are in every country in the world except for one. The country that watches the most TV in the world, they have the top reading scores in the world. What country is it? It's Finland. How can that be? Well, Finland makes really bad TV shows. And so what they have to do is they import old episodes of Happy Days and Gilligan's Island and Brady Bunch. They have to subtitle them for the kids. The kids are reading constantly. So it's a really quick win for any parent on increasing the amount you're reading. You know, so I'm always making my kids breakfast before they go to school. And so the most read item in America in the morning is not Wall Street Journal or USA Today. It's the back of the cereal box.
Yeah.
And so I always tell people have something to read on the table for the kids. And even better, there's a website sponsored by the Screen Actors Guild called storylineonline.net, where they have all these celebrities, people like Al Gore, Hector Elizondo, Lizzie McGuire, that girl, all these different people. And they read aloud storybooks for 12 to 15 minutes. And every story is also closed captioned. So I'll have the kids watch those while I'm preparing their breakfast. My own kids like TV. And I established the habit that the price of admission, they can turn on the TV, but the price of admission is they have to bring me something to read. So when they were little, they'd bring me picture books, and now they're older, they're teenagers, so they bring me like newspaper articles or magazine articles, and we read that, and then they can turn on the TV, no big deal. And then probably the best compliment my wife ever gave me, she said, "Thank you, Danny, our kids love to read because of you." I don't think my kids actually know you can go to bed without reading, because we established the habit very early on that before we go to bed, they come into bed with me and we read together. So I have, 3 kids and a wife, and we all read different things. And so like my oldest daughter, we're reading this series of books called Shadows and Bones, which is just made into a Netflix series. My son, we're reading The Killer Angels by Michael Shayra, which is about the Battle of Gettysburg. He's interested in history. And then my youngest daughter, we're reading Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, which was one of my favorite books growing up. And then my wife, we're reading, she loves the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. And so we're reading those together. I mean, but this is how it's all, Lane, this gets back to you. It's all priorities. Kids aren't stupid. They need to see us reading. They need to be read aloud to us. Read aloud by us, and we need to provide them with plenty of access to reading materials. And easy way, again, put on audiobooks. If you're too tired, I get tired too. Heck, you're a parent. I love how all of us as parents are like, oh, when I'm a parent, my kids will only eat fruits and vegetables,
Yes.
and that television will never be turned on. And literally, like within 2 months, you're like, okay, here's a Milky Way for breakfast, and watch Everybody Loves Raymond while I an hour.
Very true.
But no, it does make you, or at least me, myself, it makes me feel better. It makes me feel more intelligent. It makes me feel more grounded. I don't know whether it's just, I'm a very reactive person and I learn more by audio, but the research does say that the hearing of the audiobook is just as effective as reading.
Yeah, and if you look at research, over half of the Fortune 500 CEOs are dyslexic. Now, I've taught lots of dyslexic students, and dyslexics, they have a problem visually processing text, but they're very good at audio processing text. And so in my interviews with successful people that are dyslexic, they'll quite often say, oh, I listen to audiobooks every single day. That counts. They might not be able to physically grasp the text, but they are able to process it at an audio level. So I think it's a great way to get those minutes in every day. We're always trying to get those 20 minutes. It's like taking a walk for a half an hour a day. You don't see the results the next day, but a year later, you're a much healthier person because you've been doing it.
I'll say I have a lot of respect for TED Talks. For those who are listening, since you've been on one, could you explain to everybody what a TED Talk is and how you got picked, so to speak, to be on one?
Well, they must have had 20 people turn them down. That's how I got picked. So that's the answer. That answers the second part of the question. A TED Talk is basically you have 18 minutes to create a message to inspire the world about whatever you're passionate about. And I highly encourage people to watch TED Talks. Some of them are even shorter. One of my favorite TED Talks was by, oh God, what's his name? What's the book? Oh, okay, Benjamin Zander. Wrote one of my favorite books with it. He co-wrote it with his wife. You guys, you two should read this book. It'll inspire you. It's called The Art of Possibility. And she's like a clinical psychologist, and he's the conductor of the Boston, not the Boston Philharmonic, but one of the Boston orchestras. And he has this great TED Talk where he talks about how music is inside of all of us. I mean, I'm telling you, that is Benjamin Zander. And the book, The Art of Possibility, it's under 250 pages, so it's a lazy reader book. It's a wonderful book. I love an author I love is Malcolm Gladwell, has written some great books, The Tipping Point, Blink. And he has a wonderful TED Talk about how Howard Moskowitz changed the world. It's a wonderful story, the way he presents it. There's all kinds of great TED Talks, and you'll see them in all kinds of different areas. It's interesting. I don't know about you. You start to get so used to an acronym, you forget what it stands for. I actually don't remember what TED stands for. It's like technology, education, development. I don't remember what it stands for. Something like that. But they're great. I mean, I just digest. And then my favorite in education, unfortunately, he passed away this past summer, but Sir Ken Robinson has a wonderful talk about how schools are killing creativity. And I was like saying amen to everything he was saying. But you'll see you see people give these TED Talks all over the world, and they're about anywhere from auto mechanics to being a full-time mom to it's amazing. Brain theorists. There's literally a talk on anything, and that's what I'm always watching speakers, because I'm like, well, what was it about that person that connected me to them? How are they able to get me completely intrigued that quickly? When I'm training speakers, you mentioned Bill Clinton. Again, this isn't political. I'm like, as a speaker, he's an incredible speaker. I mean, and if you look at one of the presentations I show to people is when he accepted the nomination for the presidency in 1992, his speech was like a perfectly crafted speech. He's like, who am I? Why am I here? What am I going to do for you? And like, it's a perfect speech. I mean, he takes you through, because that's what I think. I think a perfect speech has three elements, and you guide people through that. But he was perfect with that. If you watch Malala, when she won the Nobel Peace Prize, this little Afghan girl gives one of the most incredible speeches I've ever heard. Everybody knows Martin Luther King, I have a dream. And what most people don't realize is he didn't write that speech. That's not the speech he wrote. He went off the cuff, off the script. And the I have a dream was a part of something he had done in a sermon before, but that wasn't part of the speech he wrote. But that's the part that everybody, I don't care who you are, everybody knows that speech.
Yeah.
I look at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is like 283 words, one of the most beloved speeches of all time. That tells people you don't have to be long-winded. You can tell a 3-minute speech and create an incredible point of view. So, because actually Bill Clinton's a good example, because at the 1988 Democratic Convention, he did a nominating speech for Governor Dukakis, And nominating speeches are usually like 10 minutes long, and his went 54 minutes long.
Oh, wow.
And my favorite part of the speech is he says, "In conclusion," and the entire audience stands up and applauds.
Oh, right.
Wow, what an insult. But look, he ate his humble pie, he learned from it, and he became a much more effective speaker. I mean, I'm always looking at, okay, this person had all these gifts. Now, let's see how they do on that. How are they off the cuff? Because some people, like I'll watch interviews with actors, and some of the actors that you think are like the most interesting actors, you see them interviewed and they're like the most boring people on the planet. So you realize, oh, unless they have a script, they're not that interesting.
Right.
And then some people that you wouldn't find interesting, you see them interviewed, you're like, oh my gosh, the most interesting. Actually, I'll give a perfect example. The other night I was watching Monday Night Football, and they have a different format. So they have two broadcasts now. They have the regular broadcast, and then they have a broadcast where they put down the sound, and they have Peyton Manning and Eli Manning, former NFL quarterbacks and brothers, and they just are talking and giving their critique of everything. And I watched it because I've always thought Peyton Manning is interesting. I didn't think Eli Manning would be that interesting. After watching it, I'm like, oh my gosh, Eli's much more interesting than Peyton. I thought Eli was fantastic. I was like, wow, he's so natural. I was like, wow, I would have never known that. You never know. So, I mean, like if people were ever to meet me in public with my wife, I'm usually very quiet. My wife does all the talking. She's hilarious.
All right.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm not that interesting. She's fat. She's fast. I can listen to her all day long. It's actually one of the, I need to go to bed next to her because she'll tell me about her day. It like puts me at ease, because she has the ability, my favorite thing about my wife is she takes the mundane and makes it so important. Like she'll be like, oh, what did you do today, honey? I'm like, well, I had to go over to this university. I gave a speech. I had to rush over, taught a class over here. Then I rushed over to this university, did another speech. Then I had to go over to this corporation, spoke over there. Then I had to write this and get this into the newspaper. I'm like, what did you do today? She's like, oh, I slept until 10 because the alarm went off at 10. I wanted to sleep until 11 and went off at 10. And then I realized I had to mail a letter. And so I went down to mail the letter, but they'd already taken the mail at the post at the mailbox. And so I had to walk 2 blocks over to the post office to mail the letter. And then Michael called me and he asked if we could do lunch together. So we had to go to lunch and we sat there for a couple of hours eating lunch. And like they messed up part of my order. Yeah, I mean, it's the most mundane. Like I think of the scene in Pulp Fiction where Bruce Willis has almost been raped, and he's talking to his girlfriend, and she's like, "Oh, they didn't have my blueberry pancakes." Oh, and he's like, "Oh, they didn't have your blueberry pancakes." He was almost raped that day, but no, the blueberry pancakes are super important.
That's funny.
Oh, we know people. I know people like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
So, obviously you're a very busy man. You're all over the place. You're visiting different countries. You're a husband, a dad, doing mission work. What drives you to keep going every day?
Well, I want a kid that goes through my program, Lainey, to someday win the Nobel Peace Prize. I've been blessed. I made a conscious decision years ago to only surround myself with positive people. And when I see a person that's not positive, I get away from them immediately. And one of the companies I partnered with is this great company out of Ireland called Cybersmarties. Their CEO, Diarmuid Hudner, is just wonderful. He wrote a book about bullying, but basically Cybersmarties is a social media platform for kids, and only kids are allowed to be on it. And so in order for the kid to be on it, they have to be approved by both the police department and the school system. So it's legitimately a kid. And so let's say Lane types you a message that says, Laney, I think you're ugly. It won't send it. Instead, a video pops up and says, that's not a nice thing to say. There's better options like this and this and this. And basically they found that within a couple of weeks, they've eliminated cyberbullying for all kids in Ireland. And so now the company is in the UAE, Egypt, Pakistan, India. And the way Diarmuid and I connected was he was interested in my reading program because he's like, Danny, you're different than other people. You're all about habit formation. And I'm like, that's exactly, and that's what I love about Cybersmarties. I'm like, since a lot of adults have decided to become rude and obnoxious, then the next best thing is to train the next generation how to solve the world's problems, which I'm an optimist, and I believe that everybody I teach is going to save the world. I'm like, this might be, you might be the one. You might be the
Right.
one that cures cancer. You might be the one
Yeah.
that ends racism. I mean, these are things that are very important to me. And so the platform, we're spreading it around the world to teach kids positive habits, whether it's how you interact on social media, how do you make yourself a better reader, how do you live a fitter existence and a healthier lifestyle. I call kids today idiots because they don't know what to do without a video screen in front of them.
Right.
You need to go outside and watch ants for 90 minutes and smell some flowers. It's great. I'm starting to really sound like that old guy. I'm like, my gosh, I'm like, in my day, I was the remote control. When my dad wanted a channel change, I had to get up and change the knob, and we only had 4 stations, and they always did the national anthem at midnight, and then you didn't have TV. It's crazy. I mean, but the world's changing so rapidly, and that's one of the things I argue with people. People will say, when I was a kid, I liked to read. Kids don't like to read nowadays. I'm like, well, when you were a kid, fire had just been discovered. I mean, look at all the things for kids' attention. I mean, you got TV shows and movies where the cuts are so rapid. No wonder kids have attention deficit disorder. You got the internet where a kid can open up 30 windows at a time. You got video games where some of the characters in the video games look more lifelike than some of the celebrities I saw at the Academy Awards this year. There's a lot competing for kids' attention nowadays. And people don't realize that on any given day, a kid in 2021 is exposed to more text than a kid in the 19th century was exposed to their entire life. And a lot of people, I think we have too many narrow definitions of literacy. First of all, I don't believe there is such a thing as illiteracy. I just think there's varying degrees of literacy. I mean, if you're going to go for a strict definition of literacy, I'm illiterate. If you had me read a medical journal, I wouldn't understand most of what I was reading. I don't know how to read music, so that would make me musically illiterate. So I'm not going to judge a kid that doesn't know how to read. I mean, I guarantee you, every kid in America, they go past the Golden Arches, they know exactly what that says. That says McDonald's, let's stop the car, let's go to the playland, they understand it. So it's a matter of how do I make reading something that the kids actually want to do? And I think people overblow things. I was with a 4th grade teacher and she's like, Deshaun doesn't know how to read. I'm like, oh, really? Because I just spent an hour with Deshaun, and in 1 hour's time, he must have surfed about 30 websites. He sent several emails. He texted his buddies. He's highly literate. She's using a definition from 75 years ago. Yeah. Reading doesn't mean you have to read Jane Eyre. Do I think people should read Jane Eyre? I think it's a fantastic book, but I don't think that's the way to get a lot of kids hooked on reading. I think a lot of boys, the way you get them hooked on reading is starting with a book about boogers and dinosaurs and things like that. I mean, the research is very clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. People who read more read better. They're also much more interesting people. It's the same. The reason I do podcasts, I get to meet people like you where I'm like, oh, society's all right. We still have positive people that are trying to make a difference, and they're sending something out on the airwaves that's positive and inspirational people. That's why I tip my imaginary hat to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's pretty much our mission, is just to let people talk, let people tell their stories. And you're here telling your story, and it's not one of, anguish and, oh, woe is me. It's, even if you had that component, you've risen above that. And that's what people need to hear, is that, in our eyes, that's what people need to hear, is what people go through, and then they go through it. Doesn't define them. It doesn't make them, but it's a part of them. Yeah. And so listening to your stories are phenomenal, by the way.
Well, that's the Chinese proverb: fall down 7 times, get up 8 times. And I think this is what, one of the things I love about being an American is Americans, we like to root for the underdogs. I found myself during the Olympics this year, I was rooting against America, and my wife's like, why are you rooting against America? I'm like, who am I going to root for? The American with the microchips in his Nikes, or the barefoot Sudanese refugee who just survived a civil war? And they just did his background story. He's like, I learned how to run when I was running away from the bullets during the war. I'm like, of course I'm rooting for that guy. This is what I'm always interested in. And that's why I think it's really important for us as parents to expose our kids to, hey, all these famous people, they screwed up when they were kids. I guarantee you, all of them. There's a great book I read by Martin Luther King's sister, and it's about Martin Luther King when he was a boy, always getting into trouble. And it's a really important book for kids to see. Is like before he became this pariah, he was just like you guys. He was saying stupid things. And I mean, the difference between him and an unsuccessful person is he didn't let that bad point in his life define his life. Again, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. I was speaking at a school in India. I love India. I mean, my gosh, I can't wait to get back to India. I was in Chennai and I spoke at a school, and this 5-year-old boy comes to me. He's missing his left limb, and he kind of has tears in his eyes. He's like, "You're very inspiring, but what hope do I have?" And I said, that's a really, I'm a big believer in turning what you perceive as your weakness to be your strength. I'm like, when I was a little boy, your age, I went to 18 different schools before 6th grade. Everybody called me stupid, because I stuttered. And then finally, I met a teacher, and it was kind of like the movies The King's Speech, where she would sing things to me and I would sing them back. And I gradually lost my stutter and I became a swan. But the point I wanted to make to this little boy, I said, isn't it interesting that the little boy who everybody said was stupid and couldn't talk right now gets paid ridiculous sums of money to go around the world to do what? To speak. He smiled at that. I'm like, everybody needs that. Everybody needs to see, hey, the little Lane and the little Laney out there, they're like, wow, they can be from a small town in Ohio, but look at this podcast. It's reaching anybody around the world. Yeah. And to me, that's powerful. You have no idea who's listening.
Yeah.
That person might be really down and they're like, wow, this really made my day. And because of that, they don't jump off the bridge. They go back to work and they start succeeding. I mean, it's very powerful what you do. I commend you for that.
Thank you.
I'm going to shrink you down and put you on my shelf so you can say that to me every single night before I go to bed.
So you just create a little YouTube video. You can create it and watch it every time. I can be your meme. You make a difference, Lane.
Oh, that's great. Well, we've reached the end of our questions. As much as we could just sit here and talk to you, you're a phenomenal person to talk to, and the message you've sent, I'm going to start following you. Do you have YouTube videos? Where can people find you?
Yeah, we got all that. I did want to serve you and your audience, though, for having me today. So if you go to freereadingtraining.com, again, freereadingtraining.com, I'm going to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of one of my books, Read, Lead, and Succeed. It's a book, I wrote it for a principal who he wanted to keep his faculty positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're adults. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation that you can read in 5 minutes, demonstrates the same concept. Plus, I'm going to give you access to one of the recent reading challenges I just did with parents. So for 1 week, for an hour a day, I throw out a whole bunch of different ideas, which is basically the basis of my my online reading engagement program, to get kids to read more, to read better, but most importantly, to love reading. And that's my gift to you. And thanks for being a constant gift to everybody in your audience.
Well, thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Very cool. And if I don't take anything else today away from this conversation, is that I'm going to go read little snippets of people and then go to parties and spit out little notes and just make myself sound so intelligent.
Lane, I've done that. I got to tell you, I did it with the one I always tell people about is Jackie Robinson. I knew Jackie Robinson was the first Black baseball player, whatever. Actually, he wasn't. There's another story there, but in major leagues at that point, he was the first. And I read a couple of kids' books, and I became so fascinated with them. I've now read like 9 books on Jackie Robinson. And I'm like, I don't think Martin Luther King ever happens without Jackie Robinson. I mean, this guy broke down some barriers, and it's fascinating. And that's what I'm always looking for. I'm trying to find out. I mean, I read a story today about a guy. This is what you do, lady. You just find little snippets. I mean, I subscribe to daily devotionals that give me a little prayer, but they also give me a little story. And sometimes the stories are kind of weak, but today's story was kind of interesting. It's a guy who he was going to work in Hiroshima in 1945, and all of a sudden they dropped the atomic bomb, and it's literally 2 miles away from him. and he sees the bright light and everything, and it's devastated. The whole city is devastated, but he survived, and so he walked by foot 200 miles back to his home in Nagasaki. 9 days later, he's in Nagasaki where the second atomic bomb goes off. He's the only person that they've ever proven survived both atomic bombs.
Oh my gosh.
I'm like, if I'm this guy, I'm playing the lottery, man.
Okay.
This is unbelievable. I mean, I had no idea a person was actually present for both atomic bombs. It's just, but that's what I'm looking for. Again, I don't want anybody listening here to think that reading has to be reading a novel. I mean, one of the first tips I tell people is, for all of you people who have that large book on your bedside table that you started 3 years ago, I absolve you of that book. Get another one. Over 4 million books were written in English last year. I mean, think of it. People in America are taught to finish what they start. Well, that's stupid. Think of a book like a piece of food. If you take a bite of something, oh man, that's nasty. Maybe it gets better. Oh no, it's nasty. If you don't like the first chapter, you're probably not going to like the second chapter. Get another book. It's crazy to me. And if you don't want to read a book, subscribe to magazines. Read Sports Illustrated. Read, whatever you want. I mean, I'm a sports guy, so all my magazines are all sports magazine. I mean, my wife likes entertainment magazines. Read about other people in entertainment magazines. If you like, Good Housekeeping or whatever, whatever it is, but let's not have such a narrow definition of reading. Reading is a lot of different things. Even in your car, you got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, you can point out signs to them. What's that say? Oh, that says Toyota. What's that say? Oh, look at that billboard. What's it says? It says it's a good time for a great place at McDonald's. Maybe they're going to turn into marketing executives or whatever, but get the kids paying attention to the world around them. I love, my wife always gets on my case because I'm like, oh, the kids have a wonderful TV at their disposal in the car. It's called the window. Look out the window.
Yeah.
See this country. That's what we did this summer. I was so happy. The pandemic drove me crazy just being stuck at home. And so we took our minivan and we basically drove across the entire American South. We did 13 states over a little bit over 5 weeks. And it was great because the kids, they got used to looking out the window and seeing things. I'm like, this is how you learn. You have to pay attention to the world around you. People are different, and then people are also the same. So, that's what I love about reading too. I love reading about things that I've never experienced. And, I read a book, I always tell people I read Into Thin Air by John Krakauer because I always wanted to climb Mount Everest. And after reading that book, I have no interest in ever climbing Mount Everest because of that book.
What did he explain that turned you off?
Oh, he just happened to, when he was ascending Mount Everest, it was the same time that they had this horrible blizzard at the top of the peak. Like 8 people died, and it was just miserable. One of the guys that survived, like he had severe frostbite, lost his nose and stuff. That's all I had to hear. I'm like, I don't
take that chance.
I don't have to climb Mount Everest.
They say the Sherpa can't protect you from the elements.
Yeah, exactly. I need my own Sherpa.
Well, hey, Dr. Brassell, it has been a pleasure.
Yes, it has.
And
thanks, Lane. Thanks, Laney, and thanks for breeding. We need more of you on the planet.
We got 2 more.
Yep. Noted, though. Well, thank you very much, and hopefully we can possibly talk to you again. I mean, I feel like we've only scratched the surface with you. So
anytime. We're doing some exciting work, and we're expanding our program throughout India and the UAE and Egypt. I think by the next time, hopefully the next time we talk, we'll have about 30 million kids in the program.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
Well, very good. Well, thank you very much for being on the podcast. And we want to thank everybody for your time this time. And until next time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.